We live in a society where things like hookup, networking, and gig apps define a big part of our lives. Devices, need, desire, dopamine, swipe up, swipe right, like. Some call us Generation Generate, and data is often described as the new oil.
Human experience as the free source of raw material.
Data is like oil for them.
It first became the default economic model in the tech sector, but now we see it moving through the normal economy.
It's their basic resource that they thrive off of.
Big tech companies have been in the spotlight over their far-reaching powers.
More data.
Insurance, education, healthcare.
More data.
Retail, real estate, even right back into manufacturing and basic services.
Big data.
Rich, predictive signals in our behavior.
Throughout the pandemic, life has been all the more online. And being online, it exerts a force on us in different ways, pulling us in certain directions, introducing us to new entities. And it's all being shaped by the feedback loops incentivized by the companies behind the dominant platforms, and fed by us. In this episode, I speak with William Kherbek, a curious man with a tortured eye and a tortured mind. He's a writer of nonfiction, theory, polemic, and art journalism. And he's got a new book at the printers, set to release later this summer. It's called 20 Terrifying Tales from Our Technofeudal Tomorrow. It's a collection of short stories set about 50 years into the future, a time when radical marketization has created a technofeudal world.
Wait, what's technofeudalism?
Technofeudalism is perhaps best thought of as something like a set of symptoms, rather than a specific, uniformly defined entity.
An Amazon warehouse worker or a driver for Uber. These are not well-paying jobs.
It draws on the historical power dynamics of feudalism for reference, but it incorporates capitalism. The primary engine of this value creation is the enclosure and commodification of data.
How they do advertising, how they collect data, how they use the data. Data is their business.
Data that is enclosed by private entities can then be monetized and essentially infinitely exchanged.
Now this means that in order to get more and more data, they have to constantly be expanding their extraction capacity.
Once data is enclosed, the preconditions for technofeudalism are essentially in place.
But what are the stakes here?
Our emotions, our identities, our connections. Good morning.
Hello? 1, 2. Can you hear me?
Did you ever see the film Her? The Spike?
Yeah, Spike Jonze. Yeah, I never saw it. I just knew it was going to be stupid. So.
You have a meeting in 5 minutes. You want to try getting out of bed? Get up!
You're too funny.
It's actually not too funny.
You know the premise of it?
Yeah, a guy like falls in love with an AI and then like some incel scientists create a sex doll out of her so that he can fuck it, basically.
Oh, no. That doesn't happen.
That is it. Like I remember seeing a scene
No,
where he's like about to put his
another
dick in the hard
movie.
drive or something. What's the actual? Because you've actually seen it.
He's like recently broken up from his partner he was married to and feeling quite lonely, you know, going to work, but then coming home and it's work and home and work and home. And he's a very sensitive guy who's just feeling quite lonely.
Sincel.
Sincel.
Sensitive incel.
I like that.
Hey, you know, that's my Tinder bio.
Come again?
So that's my Tinder bio. Just kidding. No, it's not true. But anyway, so the sincel.
I'm gonna verify that.
It's not true. It's false. My data self might have that, but not me.
The data self, we'll pick up on that again later. So Will and I, we finished watching the trailer. There you go.
Just looks horrible, basically.
Yeah. Okay, but like in contrast to this, it doesn't seem so dystopian.
I mean, like, what could be more dystopian, right? Like, this guy, like, literally is essentially enslaved by this machine to feed it endless amounts of information so that it can psychically and emotionally manipulate him to some end or other, some optimization that obviously he eventually acquiesced. I mean, the film should be titled, like, He Loved Big Brother. That's pretty much what it is.
He's really feeling quite good. He's in there feeling more connected than he has to anything in a long time.
But like, people in cults feel good, right? Like, if you're in some cult and been, listened to and you're given some place and people are like maybe forming genuine bonds with you or whatever, but like it's all in the service of the cult that you're in. Like the whole... What's
wrong with cults?
I'll refer you to some other podcasts. QAnon Anonymous, hosted by Travis View, Julian Fields, Jake Rockatansky, and Liv Agar. That should sort you out.
QAnon's not the only cult.
No, but it's the one that has the best podcast about it.
I mean, personally, I find cults fascinating. Not necessarily that I don't wish to join one. I be a part of one. But the dynamics of getting people in, holding people, turning them further in and against the outside world is still fascinating.
I mean, I think, that's obviously there's this lurid attraction to them. And true crime shows are very popular and, deals with stuff that obviously a film like her is also clearly at some level dealing with this, this notion of becoming dependent on something that's exploiting you.
On that note.
Don't you want devoted followers who leave their families for you, give their money to you, give their bodies to you, give up their lives for you, consider you God, and will kill for you?
I love you.
I love you.
Don't you want to become a cult leader? Since the death of God, there's been a vacancy open. You could fill that void. Here's how. Structure your cult like an onion with the most benign and helpful features on the outside and the most controlling, kooky, and evil parts at the secret inner.
The secret inner.
Don't give them time to think. Diminish doubting commiseration by separating your new recruits from each other. Surround them with happy, true believers, so when in doubt, they will tend to do what everyone around them is doing and believe that is normal. Start with a prolonged period of love bombing.
Love bombing.
Surround them with unconditional love and attention. Your cult family should act friendly and interested. Get information and hone their weak spots.
Tell us about yourself.
Take this personality test. And then use this information to manipulate them.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Gradually, over time, you'll begin to shape the recruit's behavior by granting or withholding this love and attention. After they've bonded, slowly start making...
Okay, so I think this is a great video, but on the other hand, I'm also thinking like pretty much every kind of social interaction can become a cult on this level of assessment.
I don't know about that. I mean, like, obviously every human relation has power written into it, but whoever made this video is obviously very aware of the meta theory of how you do these things. I mean, cults, you try to gather, this is how data collection works, or how platform economy works. You gather as much data as you can about someone or something, and then you can manipulate them using that. And obviously there's an emotional dimension to this stuff, personal relationships, but there will be, I think, in more advanced versions. There already is in terms of advertising and stuff. But it will also be an increasing feature of the platform economy. The social credit system in China is kind of one version of that, but it's not the only one.
So what else is there outside of China? Because it's like every time when I'm looking up stuff on the internet for surveillance capitalism and maybe even platform capitalism to a certain sense, but I think it was more surveillance capitalism, it's interesting that aside from one academic, Zuboff at Harvard, all the videos coming up are essentially about China's credit system, as if this is the only version of surveillance or even platform capitalism, if we take it a little further.
I mean, I don't even know that I would characterize it as platform capitalism in quite the same way. It's like platform statism in that regard. Right now, a lot of this is like around credit ratings. Like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff on smart cities too. I mean, these are the places where that stuff will take place, but it just hasn't reached a level of maturity in North America and Europe in the way that it has in China and in other countries that are more centralized. I mean, that's not the main reason. The main reason is New Cold War Sinophobia, the reason you see all these stories about it. But the credit system is real, and the repression that it could license is quite pernicious. But it's in a state dynamic rather than in a corporate dynamic, which is its primary difference from the way the platform economy functions in the West.
Yeah, you've got this story in your new book called Data Self-Partnered. It starts on page 55. And conceptually, it really pushes ideas around the increasing interest in our data selves. So, like, the premise, how this story starts, it introduces the idea of data shadows. And these shadows of our data, essentially the information about us that our online presence brings into existence, they can take on, or they do take on, a life or a persona of their own. So in the story, there's a woman who goes to court. She wants to make a case for the rights to marry her data shadow. And even though the case doesn't go through, she doesn't get to follow through with her wish here, what does end up happening is sparking a frenzy on the app dating scene to be able to meet and hook up with your data shadow. I'm curious what got you to write this story?
So a few years ago in London, there's a company, it's an insurance company. If you went around London bus stops, there'd be these adverts. So the same actor is playing two parts in this advert. There's sort of one guy is sort of like dunking a biscuit in a cup of tea, and the other guy is like doing his tax or something. And the next section, it's like, this is Dan, and this is Dan's data self. And it was like, meet your data self. It was essentially a credit ratings type situation where you could find out about who you looked like to companies and lenders and insurers through this process.
I'm Dan, and I'm his data self. We are inseparable. He's a physical manifestation of my financial history. He's made up of things like my transactions, my phone contract, my credit score, stuff like that. He's what companies see when they're deciding whether to offer me credit. And if I need a loan or a credit card, he'll show me what I can get. Thank you. To us. He even helped us move into a bigger place.
Get to know your data self with Experian.
There you have it.
So a couple of months before this, I'd listened to a talk by a researcher called Dr. Bev Skeggs at LSE, where she worked on these visualizations of how much data tracking that Facebook does of individuals. And it's ubiquitous. Facebook has its own data gathering mechanisms for Facebook itself on its own platform, but it has other means of finding data on other sites about you. So like even if you're logged out of Facebook, Facebook has ways of finding out what websites you're visiting, what information you're putting in to the internet, or whatever, your emails, whatever. Like Facebook has means of external data gathering outside of its own platform in a way that at that point not many other platforms companies really had, and they're still leaders in that sense. That they're really good at gathering that data and of course selling it on. But the idea is, like, if you take that notion of all this data gathering that's out there, it creates this other self that is the data self that the insurance adverts were about. And then to add a certain veneer of the moment and the presence of Carl Jung in a lot of the discourse, the idea of the shadow in a lot of his thinking is kind of an appealing joke to throw into it. The data is the shadow. It's a Jungian shadow, but of course, it's just data gathered by corporations. So how that would play out, I think every couple of months you'll see an article, somebody describes himself as, self-partnered, basically making a commitment to themselves as if a marriage commitment or something like that. Celebrity Stories or some random academic does it. And I was just like, what if all these things sort of came together in a kind of much more raw, reified kind of way? It seemed like the logical extension.
Data self-partnered. Our shadows were present in jokes, mostly. Our fears rendered inert by our awareness of our own fear. That these beings were more real than we were. That they knew things about us that we didn't. Humor was more of a shield than a sword. A way to convince ourselves that there was no risk. not really, of the shadows creating problems for us. They were distant family members to be recalled on certain occasions, but never sought out casually. They were an abstraction. They were immaterial. They could even be fun. There'd be stories on April Fool's Day, for example. Everybody would laugh. A data clone was chosen as the director of some minor firm. A data clone sports league was being created by an eccentric trillionaire living on an island in an exception zone. The first story like this I remembered reading turned out to be true. It was about a woman who had gone to court in the St. Lawrence firm zone to be allowed to marry her data shadow. It sounded like one of those old privacy campaign stunts we'd heard about from the early years of the century. Some activists would find some absurdity in the laws and push it to what they thought was a humorous extreme, counting on the good sense of society to prevail. But as the courts changed after the fall of the states, they couldn't assume a benign social gaze would greet these kinds of hijinks. The humor of suing your younger self for libel, or similar, drained away. The story about the data marriage had a lot of interesting strands. The woman who did it was an adjunct professor at a prestigious uni near Toronto. She had apparently found her data through brokers, or through lawsuits or something, and what she found suggested that the person that the web thought she was much wealthier and more successful than who she actually was. So she worked with some people from her university's computer science lab to create a hollow bot to embody and perform her shadow, so that she could converse directly with it. The lab had her recovered data to work with, and she gave them some specifics for the kind of personality she wanted her shadow to have. The shadow could advise her, she told the Idea Press, to make better life decisions. Much better than she herself does, right? And this is the whole premise for her wanting to have legal vows with her data self, that she believes she'll be able to make better decisions about her life, at least than if she married a physical person.
Yeah, definitely some irony there, as usual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you go on to write, announcing her plan on social media got her lots of writing gigs, far more than she'd had before writing about her obscure interest, something to do with language processing or phonology maybe. A publisher offered her a book deal, her first. I wonder if her data shadow advised her to do the whole thing now that I think back on it.
One can speculate. I mean, the idea of distributed computer consciousness is another big theme in the book. Like what is an AI really, and how far do we trust or believe in them, and how far should we?
And it's an interesting point, the whole reason that her lawsuit gets decided against, it's on the grounds that this marriage could not be proven to not be coerced.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what that kind of is about is, I think people attribute a lot of agency, now to like smart this, smart that devices. But, we really don't know what machines know because we don't know how they know. I mean, I'm kind of more towards the John Searle end of the debate about AI, rather skeptical about it. But if you were to take a more sort of accepting view of the idea that machine intelligence could exist or would be the same thing as human intelligence, even so, the ability to know it would be very difficult, and this smart-ass judge in the story seems to get that.
Quite ironic that indeed the entire structure that he's speaking from and being a proponent of, or at least a key component of, is arguably quite coerced.
Yeah, fancy that.
So you go on to write, clearly it was a decision aimed at trying to stop people doing financial deals with hollow bots and shadows. But the headlines and think pieces were all about the marriage side of it. Sensationalism, but also new terminology here for our technofeudal future. What's a hollow bot?
These would be like cutout entities, like shell corporations and things like that would have a personalized appearance or manifestation. Maybe like a holographic spokesperson for a product. Holographic CEO, possibly, for a company that wants to save money on having a CEO, so that they would appoint an AI being there, and then they wouldn't have to pay the AI, but they would get all the benefits of the CEO. I mean, there are all sorts of ways of interpreting those concepts. But basically, those are business epiphenomena of the technofeudal realm.
All right, I'm going to read on here. The woman lodged an appeal of some kind, but over time I stopped paying attention to the case. But the idea clearly caught on. One day, coming back from the office, I noticed in the box park on Berkeley Square that there's now a shop that can arrange dates with other people's digital shadows. Marriage wasn't allowed, of course, but no one could stop these simul dates. So what's a simul date?
You're dating a simulacrum. It's meant to have like 3 possible puns going on there. The date is a simulacrum, so it's kind of Baudrillardian thing. It's a simulated date. Obviously, there's a certain amount of simulation going on in almost any date as well. And there's just the sense of the being is not real either. And so like it's those kind of, the social, the extra textual and the intertextual meanings of simulation. But, basically it would be a simulated date with a simulated being in a simulacrum. And of course, it's a meta interpretation about dates in general in real life.
So I read on. Think pieces really started flowing about the topic once other companies got into the act. Pretty soon, there were more shadow dating apps than real ones. Data self-care became an expression you'd see on various posts. Data self-care.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you have to look after your data self. It's, it's probably the more real you.
I love this idea, data self-care. Could you imagine what a toolkit or any sort of manifesto for data self-care might look like?
That's an interesting proposition. I mean, I guess I kind of, when I originally wrote it, I thought of it as like, basically it would be something masquerading as kind of like almost like a spa mentality, but it would all be about financial health and stuff like that. Like it would audit your finances and it would audit your like spending and stuff and redirect it in such a way that you felt like you were looking after yourself or experiencing some form of personalized attention and care, but was in fact really what you were doing was just improving your credit position. Again, there might be an analog there somewhere.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you go on, this is going to be the last bit I'll read from this. It's a column that is written on this, and I quote, "And who's to say it's any less real than normal dating? In fact, data dating services might be quite a bit more honest than the old-fashioned way. Ladies, how many times haven't you found the pro self you meet on a date is quite different creature to the bloke you come back to meet 3 months later when he's specking in his pants on the sofa and listening to Ice Trap at all hours? Sure, it might take some getting used to. You're not going to be holding hands with Dad at Dreamboat while you walk to the village market on the weekend. But look on the bright side. Sure, today you may be stuck at home working while the partner of your dreams is falling for Data you. And that might seem a little bit unfair, but the more interest your data self gets, the more likely advertisers, and crucially, employers are to notice. You might be getting a leg up without leaving your sofa, and the more popular Data you becomes, the more confident you should feel. Take a chance, swipe right to swipe up the social ladder. You might just find someone, maybe even the person dating your shadow."
Not even convinced that's not a real article now. Terrifyingly proximal to some of the stuff.
Who wouldn't take that kind of advice?
Seriously, right? Like this is Big Sister telling you.
There's so many concepts in here. I just love to hit you with some of them and you tell me what this is.
I can try. 1 second while I get a drink of water.
Love gig. What's a love gig?
That's basically a paid sexual encounter.
A paid sexual encounter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's a sexgram?
Like a sex-orientated post that would be probably the kind of... I mean, I'll be honest, I didn't know exactly what... I mean, I know kind of what these things mean, but then sexgram is probably basically something between a sex-orientated Snapchat and Instagram post in some new hybrid platform they're all working from.
This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Liv Phoenix. Tune in for the next episode where Will and I continue to touch on 20 terrifying tales. We'll be talking distributed computer consciousness and identity politics. For links and credits from this episode, check out the show notes on livphoenix.com. That's LIVPHOINIX.com.